Namaste. Atharva has been doing great work, hosting wonderful speakers on a variety of topics. Today's topic is Alaṅkāra-śāstra's debt to Indic resistance against Islam. Alaṅkāra-śāstra is regarded as amongst the youngest sciences that has emanated from India. Alaṅkāra-śāstra is also known by the name of aesthetics. It is the science of beauty. It is a branch of philosophy, and it deals with the science behind beauty. When one studies classical literature, he finds a long and illustrious list of authors and scholars from Kashmir. Kashmir is also known as the land of Saraswati, Sharda Pitha. So the long and illustrious list of authors and scholars have contributed to a variety of streams of Indic knowledge. However, there is a sudden end to scholarship emanating from Kashmir, and it coincides with the start of Muslim rule in Kashmir. This has practically never recovered again from that incident. So this motivated me to basically explore how precarious the situation was when some of the seminal works of Alaṅkāra-śāstra or aesthetics were evolving in Kashmir. As we would see further, this practically refers to the period between the 6th century and roughly about the 12th century of Common Era. In this period, Alaṅkāra-śāstra practically evolved into the complete and profound science that it is today. And it was also the time when the frontier Indic kingdoms led by the Shahis and the rulers of Kashmir who put up a fabulous resistance to Islam knocking on the doors of Bharata. Before we proceed further deep into Alaṅkāra-śāstra, we should probably step back and consider the scale of what we are talking about. It is not something trivial. The period that we are talking about, the 7th and the 12th centuries, produced some of the most seminal works, not just in Alaṅkāra-śāstra, but in plenty of other fields as well. For example, the earliest available commentary on Mahabhashya was written by Kayyata of Kashmir during this period. One of the finest commentaries on Panini's Ashtadhyayi, the Kashika, was written by Vamana of Kashmir. Vamana will also feature in the Alaṅkāra-śāstra section because he has contributed Kavya-Alaṅkāra Sutravritti. Also, one of the earliest commentaries, or at least the earliest available commentary on Shukla Yajurveda, was written by Uvata of Kashmir. The Natyashastra itself of Bharata Muni is attributed to Kashmir as far as its origins is concerned. And of course, Alaṅkāra-śāstra, which evolved and matured as we've mentioned earlier in this talk. Not just that, the Kashmir also has a very interesting tradition of recorded histories, whether it is Kalhana, Jonaraja. There is no other province of Bharata which has a tradition of recorded histories like Kashmir. In fact, Kalhana records the history of Kashmir till the rule of Harsha. Finally, there is a very important element of Indian culture, which is the Brihat Katha tradition. As we know, Ramayana and Mahabharata are amongst the greatest achievements of our culture. The third and equally important achievement of the culture has been the tradition of Brihat Katha. The Brihat Katha tradition would have been lost to Bharata had it not been for the compilations from Kashmir which practically preserved it. Whether it is Somadeva's Kathasarit-sagara or Kshemendra's Brihat Katha Manjari, they have provided posterity the tradition of Brihat Katha. Even Panchatantra owes its origins to the Brihat Katha tradition. There was a lot of things happening in Kashmir in the time that we are considering, and most of them seminal. Today, without Somadeva's Katha Sarit Sagara, we would have had no Brihat Katha. In this context, we can take another step back and see what are India's contributions to world knowledge, or Bharata's contribution to world knowledge. Panini's Vyakarana, Shankara's Advaita, and Alaṅkāra-śāstra can be looked upon as three contributions of Bharata to the repository of world knowledge, which will stand the test of time. Panini's Vyakarana was the first instance where an algebraic, formulaic approach was evolved to treat a complex topic like grammar. Because of that, because of Panini's singular contribution, Sanskrit became systematized. And because the tradition respected and followed Panini, today we can access and understand anything that has been composed in Sanskrit for the past 2,500 years. Shankara's Advaita similarly brought together the different philosophical threads of Advaita into an organic whole. So whether it is Panini's Vyakarana or Shankara's Advaita, although they have become synonymous with Panini and Shankara themselves, they are products of a long tradition. Panini was the preeminent grammarian of his time, who practically compiled all the traditions around him into an elegant scheme. Similarly, Shankara did not invent Advaita. Shankara only brought the different threads of Advaita in the tradition into an organic whole. Likewise, Alaṅkāra-śāstra evolved in its own tradition. These three sciences, in a way, tell the story of the intellectual maturing of the civilization of Bharata. Panini's Vyakarana gave a lingua franca for Bharata, which was used to record and disseminate the knowledge that Bharata was producing. Shankara's Advaita provided the philosophical foundations for our culture. And then, as though to celebrate this, the Indian mind moved on to settle the questions of aesthetics. At this point, it would be pertinent to note that very few cultures pass the stage of establishing truly philosophical foundations without stopping short at theological assertions. In fact, the intolerance of Semitic faiths is a direct result of this singular stagnation in their intellectual evolution. While Vyakarana and Advaita crystallized in an era of relative peace, Alaṅkāra-śāstra evolved in a much more precarious setting, so to say. And that will be the subject of our talk today. If we have to trace the evolution of Indian aesthetics, we will have to start with the Natya-śāstra. It is a very rare privilege for any branch of knowledge to start off with an unrivaled classic. Indian aesthetics had this privilege with the Natya-śāstra, credited to sage Bharata. Scholars argue that this work must have crystallized around 100 Common Era. The central concepts of Natya-śāstra, namely rasa, vibhava, anubhava, were embraced and internalized by practitioners of all classical art forms. Natya-śāstra distilled all human emotions into 8 universal rasas, which also received universal acceptance. Natya-śāstra lists 36 Kavya Lakshanas, which evolved into Arthalankaras. Natya-śāstra had a predominant bias to the stage. In fact, it is the first encyclopedic work on stagecraft in the entire world. This also points to a very long and hallowed tradition of stage in Bharata. the concepts of rasa, vibhava, anubhava, kavilakshanas, they became foundational concepts. In fact, Natyashastra instantly established the first element of the rasa, dvani, auchitya, vakrata quartet, which is essentially the summary and substance of Alaṅkāra-śāstra. All subsequent discussions of Alaṅkāra-śāstra centered around the nature and manifestations of rasa, dvani, and Alaṅkāra. For these reasons, Natyashastra attained reverential status and many commentaries were written on it. Unfortunately, the only surviving commentary today is the one composed by Abhinavagupta in the 10th century CE. Simultaneous to the evolution of the tradition of Natyashastra, Sanskrit and its regional cousins were also flowering. The different branches of knowledge were being systematized. Different schools of philosophy were rigorously discussing the basic questions of existence, and Indic art and culture were evolving into a harmonious whole. By the end of the Gupta Golden Age, India had a large enough body of work in literature, sculpture, painting, and drama to analyze and settle the basic questions of aesthetics. Perhaps fittingly enough, the sustained efforts to understand and explain Indian aesthetics were pursued in Kashmir, the home of the famous Sharda Pitha, surrounded by the mighty Himalayas, than in classical capitals like Pataliputra or Ujjain or Kanyakubja. What better setting than the Himalayas to meditate upon the profundity and the depth of beauty? Where else can the science of beauty evolve than the Himalayas? It's somewhat poetic in itself. The earliest available work in this direction, Kavya Alaṅkāra, is by the Kashmiri-born poet-scholar Bhamaha, who is dated to the early part of the 7th century Common Era. As can be seen from the time the Natyashastra crystallized, which is say about 100 Common Era, to the next important name, Bhamaha, which is 7th century CE, we have a gap of about 600 years. It coincides with the Gupta Golden Age. It practically means we took about 600 years to digest. Astonishingly enough, down south in Kanchipuram, a younger contemporary of Bhamaha by the name of Dandi produced an equally significant work called Kavyadarsha. These two works are the starting points to trace the stage of evolution of Alaṅkāra-śāstra. They also indicate a pan-Indic pursuit of aesthetics even in the early times. Considering that at about the same time you have a work coming out of Kashmir in the north and Kanchipuram in the south, you cannot have bigger proof that the study of Alaṅkāra-śāstra was pan-Indian in nature. At about the same time, in faraway Arabia, a warlord had forged a new faith. Its followers were to become the most feared military power of the time and would go on to annex all of Arabia, most of Northern Africa, and even push into Europe as far as France and Spain, all within a decade of Muhammad's death. This mighty war machine met its match on the northwestern borders of Bharata. For close to 6 centuries, the Indic kingdoms of northwestern India would repel repeated waves of Islamic invasions and provide some of the greatest minds of Kashmir the time they needed to settle the basics of Indian aesthetics once and for all. With the benefit of history, it is surreal to think that a few relatively less known frontier Indic kingdoms were all that stood between absolute naked barbarism and a bunch of scholars meditating upon beauty for about 570 years. In light of the subsequent destruction of Kashmir by Islamic zealots, this dogged resistance of Indic kingdoms to early Islamic invasions will always remain a debt that Indian aesthetics shall never be able to repay. It is, however, a tragedy that the rest of India could not capitalize militarily upon this dogged resistance. It is a blunder for which we continue to pay the price to this day. As noted earlier, the Natyashastra established the concept of rasa as far back as 100 CE. However, complex questions surrounding the processes behind the relation of rasa and art experience itself were wide open. If I have to provide an analogy, Natya-shastra was like one of Srinivas Ramanujan's notebooks that have astonishing results known to be true, but lack the proofs or the methodology to arrive at those results. The development and culmination of Indian aesthetics would lie in resolving these questions of far-reaching consequences. While Natya-shastra had a predominant bias to the stage, the tradition we are tracing, starting with the works of Bhamaha and Dandi, had a predominant bias to classical literature. The two streams would eventually converge, and this goes on to prove the essential unity underlying art experience in general. Coming back to Bhamaha, Bhamaha emphasized on Vakrokti or oblique expression and Artha Alaṅkāra. In his work, he has described 3 gunas, about 40 different Alaṅkāras and 10 doshas. He emphasizes on the necessity of Vakrokti or novelty in expression as a prerequisite for aesthetic appeal. He makes it clear that this is required for all kinds of works, whether it is an epic poem or a standalone verse. Being a logician, he makes a caustic distinction between Vakrokti and Varta. Varta means reporting facts. According to him, in the absence of Vakrokti, a poet is merely reporting facts. And hence, he says Vakrokti is the prerequisite for poetic beauty. On the other hand, Dandi emphasized on Guna and Marga. He provides the characteristics of the different Gunas and Margas. He differs significantly from Bhamaha in many respects. Whereas Bhamaha upholds the centrality of Vakrokti, Dandi upholds the centrality of Swabhavokti. Dandi lists 10 gunas and 2 margas, Vaidarbhi and Gaudi. He upholds Vaidarbhi Marga for its harmonious blend of the 10 gunas. Dandi has also discussed doshas and some concepts from the Natya-shastra. These two works, composed during the 7th century of the Common Era, created traditions of their own for the next 200 years. While the poet scholars of Kashmir were settling into lengthy debates on Guna, Marga, and Alaṅkāra, 3 Hindu kingdoms in the northwestern borders of Bharata, Sindh, Kabul or Kapisha, and Zabul or Jabala, would see the commencement of a sustained cycle of hostilities with the Islamist hordes who would blink at no depravity in their pious, quote-unquote, task of uprooting idolatry. The kingdom of Zabul or Jabala lay south of that of Kabul or Kapisha. It was just north of modern-day Baluchistan, and it comprised the upper valley of the Helmand River. Siyastan, with its capital Zaran, which lay on the lake Zara, formed a part of this kingdom. Its king was Hindu and bore the title of Shah or Shahya. Between themselves, these Indic kingdoms held up the Islamic hordes for about 570 years. It is a veritable tragedy that an ungrateful posterity has not mainstreamed and celebrated their resistance. The earliest invasions were in the form of naval raids on Thana, near present-day Mumbai, Barwas, present-day Broch or Bharuch, and Debal or present-day Karachi. And it started as far back as 636 of the Common Era. After a crushing defeat at Debal, the Islamists decided to try the land route to Makran or present-day Balochistan. Despite their dogged pursuit, by the 8th century, the Islamists had practically nothing to show for their efforts in Sindh. For the first time in the previous 50 years, the Islamist war machine had been stopped in its tracks. Their situation was even more dismal in Kabul and Zabul. Arab records refer to a line of kings known by the name Ranbal, who ruled Kabul and seemed to have traumatized the Islamists. Although the Hindu kings seem to have had their share of setbacks, they regrouped quickly and held their ground. In fact, by the end of the 7th century, the Ranbals had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Islamists and extracted a ransom. This line of kings would eventually become better known as the Shahi dynasty. If the Islamists had tasted early success like they did in Persia or Europe, they would have, in all likelihood, been nibbling away at Kashmir and central India by the end of the 7th century CE itself. And Alaṅkāra-śāstra would probably end up stillborn. But fortunately for all of us, that was not to be. As we move into the 8th century, the early part of the 8th century saw renewed efforts by the Islamists to conquer the frontier Indic kingdoms. After yet another failed invasion of Debal in 708 Common Era, which resulted in a massive loss of men and material, even the Caliph is known to have grown despondent. It was then that Al-Hijjaj, the governor of Iraq, raised an army led by Muhammad bin Qasim, his own son-in-law, to have another attempt at conquering Sindh. And so, in 713 of the Common Era, thanks to some incredulous strategic failures of Raja Dahir, the whole of Sindh, including Multan or Mulastana, came into Muslim hands. According to the Arab chronicler Al-Baladhuri, Qasim ordered a wholesale slaughter of the inhabitants for 3 days. The daughters of Raja Dahir were apparently sent as presents to Al-Hijjaj. With this, the Islamist war machine, with all its attendant depravities, was at the gates of Kashmir. The early attempts of Qasim to invade Kashmir were repelled by the Karkota king Chandrapida. Soon, it so happened that Qasim was recalled and supposedly murdered by the new caliph in 715 of the Common Era. Some scholars dispute the version, but it is true that Qasim died by 715 CE. After Qasim's death, the Hindus of Sindh were known to have rebelled again, and the new governor Junaid had a task on his hand to just hold on to a small part of Sindh. However, in his quest for pushing forward into India, Junaid suffered reverses against Nagabhatta I of Ujjaini, Avanijanashriya Pulakeshi of Gujarat, and most importantly, for the purposes of this study, Emperor Lalitaditya Muktapida of Kashmir. To the great fortune of Kashmir, it was blessed with its greatest emperor when needed most. Scholars are unanimous in calling his 36-year rule between 713 and 750 of the Common Era as the golden age of Kashmir. He extended his empire in all directions, freed Punjab from the Muslims, and for a time ruled over the largest empire in India after the Guptas. Apart from being a military genius, he was also a great builder who built magnificent temples, including the Martand Sun Temple, whose ruins can be found in Kashmir today. In his time, all ambitions of the Islamists to conquer Kashmir were comprehensively crushed. After his death, as it happens so often, he was succeeded by his weak progeny, one of whom was Vajraditya. Vajraditya ruled from 770 of the Common Era, and according to Kalhana, he sold many men to the Mlechas. Kalhana also says that Vajraditya introduced into his kingdom practices that befitted only the Mlechas. It is known that Hisham, the governor of Sindh, between 768 to 772 of the Common Era, raided Kashmir and secured many prisoners and slaves. This is to be noted. This Muslim raid on Kashmir occurred when the evolution of Alaṅkāra-śāstra was only beginning. It could so easily have been stillborn, but thankfully that was not to be. This rapid descension to chaos was checked by Lalitaditya's grandson Jayapida, who ascended the throne around 772 of the Common Era. His 31-year rule was the last notable period of the Karkota dynasty. It is during the time of Jayapida that we see the next stage of evolution of Alaṅkāraśāstra. It was led by two scholars in his court, Udbhata and Vamana. who can be considered as the successors of Bhamaha and Dandi respectively. Udbhata is known to have written a commentary called Vivarana on Bhamaha's Kavyalaṅkāra, which is not available today. He is also supposed to have written a commentary on the Natya-śāstra, which is also not available. What remains is a small work called Kavyalaṅkāra-śāstra, which is valuable for some of the insights it contains. The value of this work can be gauged by the fact that it carries two commentaries, one by Pratiharendu Raja and another by Rajanaka Tilaka. In this small work of 79 verses, Udbhata explains 41 Arthalaṅkāras with 90 illustrations. He also holds the distinction for making the first recorded mention of the ninth rasa, Shanta. Vamana, who was a grammarian and who, like we saw earlier, composed one of the most elegant commentaries on Panini's Ashtadhyayi, composed Kavyalaṅkāra Sutra Vritti, the first work to appear in the Sutra Vritti Udaharana format, which was adopted by future aestheticians. Vamana composed Kavyalaṅkāra Sutra Vritti, the first work to appear in the Sutra Vritti Udaharana format, which basically means aphorism, explanation, illustration, which was adopted by future aestheticians. Earlier in the talk, we referred to Vamana having composed one of the most elegant commentaries on Panini's Ashtadhyayi called Kashika. It was probably his systematic mind which came up with this elegant Sutra Vritti Udaharana format. He was also the first scholar to extensively quote the past masters of prose and poetry in support of his ideas. This was also extensively adopted by future aestheticians. Vamana recoined the Marga of Dandi as Riti and added a third flavor, Panchali, to the two Dandi had established. Like Dandi, he also upholds the Vaidarbhi Riti. He elaborates the 10 guna of Dandi into 20, based on their application to Shabda and Artha respectively. He also discusses 32 Alaṅkāras and some doshas. During the same period, when Udbhata and Vamana were doing their work in Alaṅkāra-śāstra, the tiny kingdoms of Kabul and Zabul were still holding on to their territories. In fact, the Islamists, having grown weary of the stalemate, even found it beneficial to negotiate tributes with the Shahis in return for not attacking them. As the Arab historian Al-Baladhuri mentions, the Shahis regularly ceased to pay tributes. However, the territories of Shahis started coming under pressure from the Karkotas of Kashmir. Although Emperor Lalitaditya seems to have been visionary enough to recognize the common danger of Islamists and confer high offices on Shahi princes, his successors did not follow the same tradition. As a result, the Shahis had to deal with the Islamists on one hand and the Karkotas on the other. By the end of the 8th century, they were holding on just about well enough. Sindh was also proving to be a hot potato for the Islamists. Al-Baladhuri records, and I quote, while Al-Hakam ibn Avana al-Kalbi was ruler, the people of Al-Hind apostatized, with the exception of the inhabitants of Kasa. A place of refuge to which the Muslims might flee was not to be found. So he built on the further side of the lake, where it borders on Al-Hind, a city which he named Al-Mahfuta, establishing it as a place of refuge for them, where they should be secure and making it a capital. In addition, they also built another city called Al-Mansura. During the middle of the 8th century of the Common Era, Hisham seems to have reconquered Multan. And so, at the end of the 8th century of the Common Era, the Arabs had not more than 3 cities of Sindh to show for their 175 years of pursuit. Simultaneously, Alaṅkāra-śāstra was just about beginning to evolve. In the subsequent centuries, starting from the 9th century, the development of Alaṅkāra-śāstra would pick up steam. Also, the story of the tiny kingdoms on the frontiers of Bharata and their bigger cousins in the mainland of Bharata would also start to become more interesting. We will now move to the 9th century. And the way this narrative will go is we will juxtapose historical events against the different milestones in the evolution of Alaṅkāra-śāstra. So when we move to the 9th century, we see that it's a period of turmoil for most of the dynasties involved in our narrative. On the Muslim side, the Abbasid Caliphate was past its golden age under Harun al-Rashid, and they were being pushed back by the reconquistadors in Spain. They also had many internal struggles in the caliphate, and this was sort of weakening the caliphate. It meant that their authority in newly acquired Sindh on the Indian northwestern border would also slacken, and it did. As a consequence, the governors of Sindh were content to retain Multan and Mansura than trying to extract more territory from the ferocious Indic kingdoms. On the Indian side, in Kabul, the Shahis were being torn by dissensions that would eventually end in a revolution. In Kashmir, after the death of Jayapida, his successors were mostly incapable, and the Karkota dynasty entered a phase of terminal decline. In interior Bharata, a draining power struggle was developing between the Gurjara Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Palas. So it was going to be a century where a lot of things would happen. However, by the early part of the 9th century, the mighty Pratihara Empire stretching all the way to the borders of Sindh meant that the Arab movement into India through the Punjab was effectively sealed. So the Arabs then had to concentrate on breaking through Kabul and Kashmir to enter India. These are regions central to this narrative. While the Karkotas were declining, Alaṅkāra-śāstra was somewhat stagnating, with only incremental advances in the past 200 years. Whatever we saw of Bhamaha, Dandi, and their successors, although was a good starting point, they were only incremental advances. Rudrata, dated to around 850 of the Common Era, is one of the last representatives of this phase of incremental advance. His Kavya Alaṅkāra contains the first attempt at systematically classifying Alaṅkāras. Cumulatively, he illustrates about 66 Alaṅkāras classified under 4 heads. He adds a new Riti called Latiya in addition to the 3 established by Vamana. He also propounds a 10th rasa called Preyo Rasa. In addition, he is amongst the first to discuss aspects of Auchitya. If you remember, we had said that Rasa, Dvani, Auchitya, and Vakrata, this quartet is the sum and substance of Alaṅkāra-śāstra. So, Rudrata, by being the first to discuss aspects of Auchitya, retains a halo of his own. So, he must be credited with share of originality in advancing the discourse. By and large, the next big leap in the evolution of Alaṅkāra-śāstra had to wait just a little longer. In contrast, a new revival was happening as far as the philosophical analysis of the concept of rasa as applied to the stage. We had seen earlier that Alaṅkāra-śāstra sort of grew in 2 parallel paths and converged eventually. One was related to the tradition of Natya-śāstra and developed through stagecraft, and the other was through classical literature culminating in Anandavardhana. And Abhinavagupta will eventually fuse these 2 margas and show us that they are one and the same. Anyway, coming back, in the early part of the 9th century CE, 9th century of the Common Era, there lived in Kashmir a philosopher named Bhatta Lollata, primarily adhering to the Mimamsa school. He propounded the Utpattivada for rasa. According to him, spectators enjoy not their own permanent emotions, but the Upachita Sthai Bhavas, or intensified permanent emotions of the characters, and therefore indirectly of the actors. We do not have any of Bhatta Lollata's works available today. We know of his views primarily on account of their discussion in the works of Abhinavagupta, Rajashekara, and Mammata. His younger contemporary, Sri Shankuka, was another philosopher from Kashmir, primarily adhering to the Nyaya school. He is known to have lived in the middle of the 9th century of the Common Era. He propounded the Anumitivada for rasa. He argues instead that rasa is to be inferred, and hence the spectator must be active and non-passive. On the whole, Sri Shankuka advanced the philosophical debate to the realization of rasa from what was advanced by Bhatta Lollata. By now, I think some of you will be noticing the difference between the approach in the Natya-śāstra tradition as against the approach in the classical literature tradition which Bhamaha and Dandi were pursuing. In this tradition of Natya-śāstra, the spectator or sabhika has a very central role already. But on the classical literature tradition, neither Bhamaha nor Dandi have explicitly made the spectator or the connoisseur in that case an integral part of their discussion yet. Anyway, coming back to the Natya-śāstra tradition and Sri Shankuka, we do not have any of his works also available. We know of his views also primarily on account of their discussion in the works of Abhinavagupta, Hemachandra and Mammata. While the likes of Rudrata, Bhatta Lollata and Sri Shankuka were blissfully compiling their work, the Shahis of Kabul were undergoing a revolution. Their ruler Lagathurman was deposed by his Brahmin minister Kallar in 850 of the Common Era. He is addressed as Lalya Shahi by Kalhana. Lalya Shahi and his successors are referred to as the Hindu Shahis to distinguish them from the earlier Turki Shahis who were primarily Buddhists. Around this tumultuous time, in about 867 of the Common Era, a Turkish leader, Yaqub ibn Layth, who started his career as a robber in Siyastan and later founded the Safarid dynasty of Persia, saw an opportunity in Zabul, one of the three kingdoms which we introduced in the early part of this narrative. He is known to have invited the reigning king of Zabul, holding the Ranbal surname, for a truce and executed him by treachery. Now, the treachery executed by Yaqub ibn Layth seems to have been a new low even by Islamic standards as recorded by their own chroniclers. Nuruddin Muhammad Aufi says about this, and I quote, "This victory which he achieved was the result of treachery and deception such as no one had ever committed." But then, as they say, it all counts. And with this, the Indic rule in Zabul came to an end. Commentating on it, Dr. D.C. Ganguly in the monumental history and culture of the Indian people says, "The king of Zabulistan was killed and the people embraced Islam. Henceforth, this petty state that had carried on a prolonged and heroic resistance against the Arab aggression for more than 200 years ceased to belong to India either politically or culturally." The key thing here is ceased to belong to India either politically or culturally. In essence, this is the problem that Bharata faced with Islam. Islam was not only taking territory from Bharata, but it was destroying its culture. Before Islam, the Indian subcontinent had invasions of the Greeks under Alexander and the Huns, but that has never registered in the Bharatiya mind the way the Islamic invasions have. The reason is the Hunas or the Greeks did not make a very big difference to the cultural integrity of Bharata, whereas Islam directly came to kill Bharatiya tradition and Indian Bharatiya culture. This is the big difference, and that is reflected in Dr. D.C. Ganguly's comment. Anyway, continuing with the narrative, in the meanwhile, Lalya moved his capital from Kabul to Udbandapura, the modern-day village of Und on the right bank of Sindhu, 15 miles above Attock in Rawalpindi district. Kalhana states that Lalya's kingdom was situated between those of the Turushkas and Darads, basically between Kabul Valley and the Kishanganga Valley in Kashmir. Thanks to Lalya Shahi's labors, the Hindu Shahis recovered quickly and stood tall again. Around the same time, in 857 of the Common Era, the empire of the Karkotas was over and Avanti Varma of the Utpala dynasty ascended the throne of Kashmir. He brought much needed stability to Kashmir after nearly 4 decades of instability. His prime minister Suya was an engineer also and is credited with changing the place of confluence of Vitasta and Sindhu by diverting their courses. Vitasta is Jhelum. As a result, plenty of surrounding lands became fit for cultivation and food grain production skyrocketed. Avanti Varma also founded the cities of Avantipur and Suyapur, named after Suya, of course. He was a patron of arts and is known to have built the Avantishvara and Avantiswamy temple in Avantipur. It was in this island of peace that our third stage of evolution of Alaṅkāra-śāstra took shape. In the court of Avanti Varma, there lived a poet and aesthetician by the name of Anandavardhana. He is believed to have lived between 820 and 890 of the Common Era. He probably lived some part of his life under Avanti Varma's son Shankar Varman also. Just like Albert Einstein gave a whole new dimension to physics, Anandavardhana gave a whole new interpretation to Alaṅkāra-śāstra. His classic Dvanyaloka elevated what was mostly degenerating into a cosmetic discussion surrounding form to the level of a profound philosophy. Although it's possible that he was inspired by some earlier scholars, it would only be fair to accept that it took the native genius of Anandavardhana to unravel the philosophical underpinnings of Dvani or poetic suggestion. Anandavardhana harmonized the discussions of Bhamaha, Dandi, Vamana, Rudrata, Udbhata, and others with a central concept of rasa espoused in Natya-śāstra by primarily relying upon Vyanjana Vritti, or the process of poetic signification. He mainstreamed the role of Auchitya as the indispensable ingredient of anything that produces rasa. He was the first to uphold that Sahridaya or connoisseur is an integral part of art experience. Of course, this is in the classical literature tradition. With the help of these revolutionary insights, he established that rasa is evoked through the realization of dhvani or suggestion, triggered by vakrata or beautiful expression created by the genius of the artist within the bounds of auchitya or property. This is the definition of a few centuries of labor that aestheticians of Kashmir undertook. Here, the term vakrata encompasses all aspects of guna, riti, and alankara that had been the central points of discussion with earlier aestheticians. This concept was so powerful that all future discussions of aesthetics had to be centered around dhvani. One could accept it or deny it, but no one could ignore it. This already formidable work was further fortified with the erudite commentary called Lochana of Abhinavagupta. Between Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta, every hypothesis-proof pair of every important aspect of art experience was covered. Even today, nearly 1100 years after their works were completed, this pair enjoys uncontested status in aesthetics. Dvanyaloka was probably complete by the time Avanti Varma's rule was over, sometime around 883 of the Common Era. Those would be the last great years Kashmir would ever enjoy. There ensured a brief civil war, after which Avanti Varma's son Shankar Varma captured the throne. Despite his military abilities, he was not known to be a good administrator, and according to Kalhana, he oppressed his subjects with numerous extractions. His tragic death during a military mission in 899 of the Common Era thrust Kashmir into a terminal decline from which it would never recover. We shall now move into the 10th century of the Common Era.